Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of DarshanTalks. I am your host, Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission to help patients trust the products they depend on. As some of you know, I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA-regulated products. So if you ever think about drugs, you wonder about medical devices, you consider cannabis or obsess with pharmacy, this is the podcast for you. I do these video podcasts because they're a lot of fun and I find myself learning something new each time. It'd be great if I knew someone was listening as well. So if you like what you hear, please leave a comment, please subscribe. You can find me and ask me questions on DarshanTalks on Twitter, or just go to our website at darshantalks.com. Today's podcast is going to be amazing because the guest I have today is the litigation lawyer extraordinaire. I've known him for several years. I've known him through the American Bar Association. He has represented pharmaceutical companies in the context of litigation in general and fraud. And I discovered today his practice is actually much broader than I even knew. So our guest for today is counsel at Baker Donelson. He wrote the treatise on pharmaceutical law for the American Bar Association. He was one of the people who invited me to actually write some of the chapters for it. He is my editor-in-chief. Is that the title, editor-in-chief?
I think that's right, yeah. I think that I'm the editor-in-chief, exactly.
And he's also, because he felt he was bored, he's also editor-in-chief on for another book on corporate criminal liability at Thomson West as well. So if you're looking for someone who knows what he's talking about around litigation, around fraud, around pharmaceuticals, this is probably the conversation we're listening on. So our guest for today, Michael Clark. Hey, Michael, good to see you.
Well, it's great to see you. I was thinking, Darshan, the last time we saw each other in person was in San Diego at a function, which I don't know how many years ago that was, but now with COVID and remote Zooming and all the other mechanisms, it's great to see you.
It's really wonderful to see you. I'm actually surprised that it's been that long because I kind of feel like 2020 almost is the year that never happened because I don't know how to count it.
It's been a long, strange road, as the Grateful Dead said in one of their classic songs. Yeah, I'm glad it's in the rearview mirror. I'm all vaccinated up, and COVID is in the past. I got it last July, and don't recommend it for those who haven't had it. It's just not a whole lot of fun. But
I had COVID myself last year, and I got the vaccine earlier this year. I thought it would be unnecessary because I already had the bug. Turns out I was wrong. Not so much. But this is wonderful, and the reason it's wonderful is because we are seeing a major change around litigation, especially in the context. Well, one of the things we haven't talked about is actually your experiences around teaching people on how to litigate. And could you talk a little bit about that before we go down that path?
I've been all my career, I've been a trial lawyer. I started out wanting to learn how to try cases, and one of my mentors said, go work for a prosecutor's office. And so I did that for the local district attorney, and probably overstayed my welcome, 5 years doing that. And then I became a U.S. attorney, assistant U.S. attorney, and came at the right time because when I joined the office in the Southern District of Texas back in '87, I guess, we had 53 AUSAs, and I was number 54. And then the savings and loan crisis hit in Texas, where every bank failed at least once, oftentimes twice or three times, because the government was basically bundling failing institutions into bigger failing institutions, which would then fail again. And so we got hit with this incredible number of failed bank institutions and savings and loans, and we were charged with trying to figure out, now what do we do? And taught ourselves, how to handle those cases. So I quickly got promoted, which was a good thing for me as a career advancer, and I became one of the chairs of financial litigation division, and flew around Texas helping coordinate those cases. And then was thinking about wanderlust again, and then I got promoted to be the head of the criminal division at the district, which I did for 4 years, and then had to make a decision: do I stay or do I go? And I looked at the idea of being a Fed until I was probably in my early 70s and said, I just can't do it. I had kids coming. And so, along the way, probably, I stopped counting at 100 jury trials. I thought, okay, that was enough. And I've been out in private practice, Darshan, since 98. I came in as a lateral partner for a large law firm and didn't really think at that time they knew what to do with somebody like me as a white collar. Went and joined with a few friends that were former AUSAs, a little bit older than me. And after a decade, I realized one partner was turning 80 and one was turning 70. And here I was 50, and not a good long-term configuration. So anyhow, through the machinations, I'm now with Baker Donaldson. And, one of the reasons I joined this firm is because they have a strong health law group practice. And along the way, I kind of gravitated into health law, as you know, got active in the ABA health law section, worked my way up to be the chair, and have now kind of gone on to pasture. I'm on the past chairs committee, but I've taught at the law school and got a master's in health law. And actually, what might be of some interest to you in the audience, I got hooked into teaching an online course on pharmaceutical fraud.
Aha.
And I did that for the University of Florida's College of Pharmacy, master level pharmacy students. And that was kind of cool doing that online. I did that for about 5 years and kind of decided that, the extracurricular activities needed to give way a little bit. So, but pharmaceutical fraud is a really hot and interesting area. And, it's going back to the idea of follow the money. And obviously the money's in this industry.
So let's start with the first step. And it's an interesting comment you ended on. Follow the money is in this industry. But you started with the savings and loan crisis. How does a financial litigator go into healthcare fraud? What drives you?
What actually got me hooked into this, many years ago when I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office, there were cases coming in the door about healthcare fraud, and nobody knew how to do them. And so I said, look, I wanted to be a doctor at one time. This is as close as I'm going to get. But at those, back in the old archaic days, the healthcare fraud cases we were getting were much different. I mean, you wouldn't go into medical necessity prosecutions. The only medical necessity prosecutions we would handle would be drug diversion. And, okay. At that time, I was seeing doctors that were, abusing triplet prescriptions, which was kind of brain dead anyhow, because there's 3 records of it. And, even though the idea of, looking at the trend lines and who were the big prescribers was really rudimentary, it was pretty obvious, who was prescribing heavy duty narcotics. I had one doctor, for example, that I tried twice. The first trial was hung jury 11-1 after about a 4-week trial. And I knew I was in trouble when the jury sent out a note saying one of our jurors refuses to deliberate without his lawyer present to advise him. And I said, okay, this one is not going well. And, it hung up 11-1. So I retried it. And anyhow, this anecdotal story, I'll make it quick. The doctor, in the first time I tried it, his argument as to the drug he was prescribing, which was basically pharmaceutical methamphetamine, was that he was using it for refractory depressed patients, because there was some literature in the early 60s that this drug could be used for refractory depression. Mm-hmm. That didn't go over well, obviously, in the first trial, other than the fact that they had a nut juror that I managed to be on the jury panel. So when I tried it the second time, his reasons for prescribing shifted dramatically, and it became not refractory depression, but as a weight maintenance program.
Okay.
It didn't go over well. I think we got him convicted of 100+ counts of, prescribing drugs for improper purposes, outside the ordinary course of medical practice, not for a legitimate medical purpose. So that was kind of my introduction.
I have to ask questions because there's so many questions that come out of that. The first question I have to ask, though, is doctors are allowed to prescribe off-label. In this specific instance, you were talking about a drug that was basically a type of methamphetamine. Was it methamphetamine or was it something else?
No, it was Desoxin is the name of the drug, okay. which is pharmaceutical methamphetamine, basically.
Right. Okay. So I guess my question is, theoretically, it's an off-label use by a physician who's
Right.
allowed to prescribe off-label. So what was the gap? Because we talk to physicians all the time, and their response to us when I talk to them is, "I'm allowed to do this."
Well, sure.
Who are you to decide I'm not?
Well, what you look at are badges of fraud, right? And so one of the badges of fraud that we were able to emphasize was the fact that this gentleman didn't have any linen service to, take care of his medical office. And, so basically, it's not what you'd expect a doctor to be doing. I mean, we got evidence that people would line up before the medical practice would open, and there happened to have been within, I don't know, maybe a block or two, a pharmacy that filled all these prescriptions, and they would just kind of shuttle over from one building to the other. And so, these are the types of things that, yeah, you can take your defense and stake it out there, but you have to be able to think through logically. What would a reasonable juror expect that a reasonable doctor would be doing? And, the fact that this guy was a nice guy, but, he obviously wasn't doing what was expected. And I had one witness who was a firefighter for the city of Houston who was a drug addict. And, I basically was able to ask him, well, why were you getting Desoxin? Well, because it's pharmaceutical grade methamphetamine, I mean, it's the best,
Right.
He was a former fireman, I should say at that point.
Especially after you were done with them.
But, and then we saw some evolution of the types of cases outside of just the DEA diversion. We had cases that came in the door. And then when I was the criminal chief, the healthcare fraud push started, and we were asked to develop healthcare fraud cases, which, seemed kind of counterintuitive to me at the time. One of the things about being a Fed is that you don't have to worry about client development ostensibly. But here we were charged with trying to develop healthcare fraud cases. And so, that has continued obviously over the years. And, my practice has evolved since I went into private practice. I do a False Claims Act defense and things of that nature. But as you and I talked about briefly, I've got kind of a bizarre practice. I'm a litigator, and I've never wanted to be pigeonholed as one way or the other. And right now, it seems that I'm doing more white collar, but I also do basic general commercial litigation, and I've done environmental litigation, I've done securities litigation, basic contract cases, bet the company cases, and I'm getting to think, I'm in my early 60s. This is becoming to, at some point looking back, saying, "Dang, it's been a long, strange." Path I've taken, but it's been enjoyable. Yeah.
Let's pick on something you said, which is, so I'm not a litigator, as you know. I tend to be a transactional regulatory lawyer. You use the term developing a healthcare fraud case. What does that actually mean?
Well, we have a lot more activities now in data mining and looking at, aberrant prescribing practices, aberrant billing practices. Those are certain areas, obviously, that are out there. The techniques that were developed by federal prosecutors in drug cases have kind of meshed over into healthcare fraud. You have use of undercovers. Now, undercovers were fairly normal in drug diversion cases because DEA would be known to send in a bogus patient and give the doctor an opportunity to act as a legitimate doctor would. And then they would use things like street names for the drugs. Why are you here to see me? Well, I want some mollies and some, whatever. And so these were testing the integrity of doctors. But, now it's not unheard of to have people that have been squeezed, if you would, and are trying to work off their exposure by, testing the integrity, if you would, of professionals. And, so this is easy to do. You have people that agree to make phone calls and call and say, "Don't you remember when we did this?" or something of that nature, to get them to say something incriminatory. That happens. You have it's not as easy to do, but you do have Title III wiretaps that get set up in healthcare fraud cases.
Wow.
And then because of the Stored Communication Act is easier, that applies to, social media and things that are stored, like email that's older than 180 days and things of that nature. You don't need to get a search warrant per se. You can get a court order. It's a much easier process. So there's a lot of ways that these cases are being developed. But the other aspect of it that we haven't talked about, with the advent of the healthcare fraud statute as part of HIPAA, and private payor fraud being now a potential federal case, you have a lot of former FBI agents that get hired on by insurance companies in their special investigations unit, and they shop their cases to their friends at the FBI. And so that's a lot of client development right there. I mean, if you think about it, if I'm a large insurer, it's a lot easier to get the federal government to become my collection agency, and I don't have to worry about filing lawsuits, right? You can just basically say, let's make this a crime. And if you have a friend who, is in the FBI and is a friend of your former colleague who's now in your special investigative unit, I mean, it's kind of a slimy pathway, quite frankly, but, there are some practical issues out there that you have to be aware of.
So what I'm hearing you say is that we've gone from trying to from per se or near obvious types of fraud to using techniques like data mining and looking at aberrant prescribing and aberrant marketing to basically find scenarios. And now that we're almost I don't even know if this is a word, but making it extremely lucrative, or lucratizing, if you will, the idea of having insurance companies or having other individuals come out and basically create a fraud claim that the government can take on, and you identified this as being problematic, but do you you've moved from the plaintiff side, well, the prosecution side, to the defense side. How do you address that? Do you tend to take on cases after the fact, as always, because that makes the most sense, and people reach out to you going, I'm in trouble? Or do you tend to guide people on these are things you should be looking for, considering you are now in a position where these types of things are happening? Is your practice ever proactive?
I try to be, and yet, that's always an issue. It's an issue of how risk averse your clients are going to be.
Yeah.
And I would much rather be proactive, and I have some clients that I was able to keep from being wiped out in False Claims Act cases where we've come back in and said, let's get you bulletproof that this doesn't happen again. And so that part, I don't like having to take a client into the courtroom, and civil or criminal, it's just an ordeal. Even if they come out on the back end ahead, it's never the same. So yeah, I do like to be proactive and explain to them that the fraud and abuse, civil or criminal, it's kind of like Alice in Wonderland going down the rabbit hole where you're dealing with the Red Queen, and it's a new reality. And, it's a very difficult situation. I think I mentioned to you that I'm now representing I got a few physicians, clients that are facing criminal investigations. And, I look at these cases and think, back in the day when I was doing this type of work on the prosecution side, I wouldn't have brought these types of cases. But it seems like I'm seeing medical necessity cases that are, the government's willing to bring in some experts as medical witnesses and try to show that the physicians were not acting appropriately. So it's an evolving world, but what used to be abuse is now being called fraud. And and there's new tools, as you know. I mean, there's asset freezes and other things that can be done to keep keep companies or individuals from being able to successfully mount their defenses, and separating the attorneys from their clients by seizing all the money. It becomes a real problem.
So how do you deal with things like asset freezes? Because I actually have a client right now I'm dealing with where all the money that he could access is being blocked because of it's not a criminal case or anything like that, but it's...
Well, that's the proactivity of it, though. You've got to convince the client that there's a real need to leverage their money. And if you think about the forfeiture laws in particular are very scary, because the theory that the government has been able to get courts to agree with is that, when a fraud was committed, title vested in the United States. So while they may think they have $1 million or $2 million, that's liquid, the government's position is, no, it's our money. And so what you've got to do is you've got to put it to work by putting it into an IOLTA account that they can have the attorney bill against. Even that is not bulletproof. I mean, back in the day when we had Enron, we had one of those defendants, and another lawyer brought us in, me and my partners, and there was a 7-figure sum that was earmarked for the trial, and the dang government seized it out of an IOLTA account. We were able to basically beat them up in the courtroom because their tracing methodology was wrong, and so they backed off. But it does happen, and it's not very gentlemanly to take a lawyer's money away from them, at least encumber it, right? So companies are different. I mean, if they are heavily into federal program reimbursement, the spigot's going to get turned off. I mean, that's a clear thing. And then, private insurers will follow suit. So it is a practical problem, but what do you do? I mean, I put into my engagement agreements a recitation for the client to certify that all these funds are free and clear, not subject to any liens or encumbrances. I mean, but beyond that, are you supposed to go out and hire private investigators to source the funds for you, or are you allowed to take your client's representations at face value if you don't have red flags? I don't think we've gotten that far where I have to go hire a Kroll to trace it out in Europe or something. But I mean, these are practical issues, and I've encountered one of those just recently with a friend who brought me in on a case where a very aggressive AUSA was, seeking ex parte court orders, and I don't need to spend an hour on it, but I mean, it does make you think, what is reasonable under the circumstance, and it's a real problem.
How do the courts view that, shall we say, a more aggressive stance that's being taken in these scenarios? And is say insurance a good way to mitigate these considerations?
Well, I think the courts generally allow it, and there's not much in the way of opportunity to attack that. I mean, the standard is very differential to the government, right? Credible evidence, I think, is the standard that they have to come up with. What the hell is credible evidence? It's beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? And so that's the prosecutor defining the world. Well, the Supreme Court has said, however, that there is a line under the Sixth Amendment where you cannot interfere with a person's right to be represented by counsel. And so as long as you can show that these are funds for counsel's use, there are some opportunities to do that. But you have to structure your engagement in a way that you try to protect it as much as you can, but it's not ironclad. If I don't have reason, for example, to know that they're going to claim that these assets are dirty, then I think it's a much more manageable situation.
Right.
But if I have reason to know if there's red flags, then I think my obligation, I'm on inquiry notice to go further, and that increases.
Have you been in a situation where you represented a client? It was very clear as soon as you saw the evidence, and especially after you tried the case, that the prosecution didn't have many grounds to go after your client. And have you actually sued And has that been successful? How has that been viewed, if you will?
I've had a few clients that have received target letters. We plan to indict you, and in the stratification, you have three categories: witness, which is always where you want your clients to be; subject, which means that they think you've done something wrong, but they don't have enough evidence; target is just like it sounds, the worst place to be. But I've had a few clients. I don't want to do anything to reveal any identities, but I had one physician in particular that he not only got a target letter from the local U.S. attorneys, but one from Main Justice, which is DOJ trial division. And we were able to go in and show them that their theory didn't hold water. It had to do with time-based codes. That was the theory, but these were not time-based codes. So we were able to show them, look, you can try, but that's not going to work. And so they just gracefully didn't pursue it. They never tell you, not never, rarely do they tell you we're going to drop the investigation. But, after limitations runs, the investigation's not going to go anywhere, right?
Fair enough. So what I'm hearing you say, do you recommend a more conciliatory approach as you're doing this? Or do you clients, obviously, when they start off, when they're in this position, they tend to want to go hard and put the fear of Jesus into the other side's eyes. But do you find that tactic works, or have you generally found that it's easier to go more in a conciliatory way and manage from there?
Well, who has the power is the first operative question. You have to be pragmatic about it. So conciliatory to a point. If people lie to you, the time for, conciliatory conduct is gone. But, you pick your battles wisely, right? I mean, I think you can be conciliatory without being showing weakness. But at the end of the day, they have to understand that you have substance. And if they push too hard, if your client doesn't have options, then they're going to buy themselves a trial. My former law partner is a very good lawyer out of Dallas named Dan Guthrie. He and I were involved in representing a client in a scorched earth False Claims Act case for 6 years. We fought like hell. I mean, we made everything very difficult for the government, and at the end of the day, had a wonderful outcome. I never want to be a jerk about things, but I want them to know that, if you really want to push the envelope and think that the client is going to roll over, it's not going to roll over. So that's my approach, is to, not brag, but show in pleadings and other things that you know what you're doing, and probably know what you're doing better than they do, and you work harder than they do. And I think it makes a big difference. That's where the quality of counsel, I think, makes a big difference.
Have you been in a situation where you've had to bring a malicious prosecution type argument back?
I haven't. I might have been able to in a case or two, but it's a high standard. I mean, you've got the Hyde Amendment in criminal cases. It was passed when the government unsuccessfully prosecuted Representative Hyde, and so his legacy was they passed this law basically saying that the standard that's available for civil litigation under the Equal Access to Justice Act will apply in certain types of criminal cases, but you've got to show that you substantially prevailed. And it's a pretty hard thing to do.
Okay.
But it's there. I wrote an article about it many years ago, and I think it was called "Nothing to Hide," and it was kind of a play on words. Basically talking about there is a remedy, but how real is the remedy? And it's a hard burden to prove.
Very cool. I had promised to keep you on for about 20, 25 minutes. We're already beyond that because you are a fascinating speaker. A couple of questions. The first question is, do you have any question for the audience?
I'm always interested in things like this. What resonates, what would they like to have heard me talk about? I thought maybe I would talk about securities fraud issues and why they're so important in this industry, because most drugs that are being developed will fail, and there's always a problem of what do you say along the way to keep investors happy, and are you meeting your matrix? I had a client that was a speculative bettor who hit the home run grand slam, really, in a penny stock that involved a new drug development, and it was a fascinating case. So I'd be very curious about the audience. I'd be happy to answer any questions anybody would have. That's why we do this, is to prospect and meet new people. But it's been a lot of fun. I just feel like I'm doing a monologue, and I apologize for that.
Not at all. This was actually a lot of fun, for me at least.
Yeah.
What I do also want to add is, now that you mention it, we need to bring you on, because we need to talk about what could people do around AMC and GME stocks. And I don't know if you followed that at all, but
yeah, a bit.
So that could be just a fun conversation to have. Yes, it doesn't relate to pharma, but you kind of give an example of a situation where that very, very well could be similar to pharma, quote unquote activist investors. So we definitely got to bring you back.
It's a fun, crazy world. I've got this. I kept one of my chapters in the treatise after, kind of like you. When you said you'd like to write a few, I said, really? Have at it. And when I first put the treatise together, I ended up by default doing, I think, 4 chapters. And I said, no, that's too dang much. And so I've cut it back to 1 chapter, which is my securities law chapter. And these cases are fascinating because, there's so many different permutations of where companies get into trouble in this industry because of investors and trying to please people. And, sometimes it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. But I'd love to talk about that at a later time. That'd be a fun topic to go into.
We're definitely bringing you back for that topic. We may need to do it sooner rather than later because it's so topical right now. As I mentioned, we do a couple of rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. What was the best part of your job this week?
My best part of my job this week. I finally got through dealing with a USA who was making a claim on some monies that I had with the client, and I got to bid him adios. And that's another story. It's just sometimes you deal with the lowest common denominator, and that was my big accomplishment. Non-billable, dealing with a pain in the backside, a person who thinks that they're far more powerful than they really are.
Oh, I have so much to unpack there, but not this second. What did you learn this month?
Well, I can't say anything in particular jumps out that I've learned this month that's really a huge revelation. I've been looking into with a new client this therapy that has to do with the use of magnets to deal with the refractory depression, and that's fascinating for me. I had one time wanted to be a doctor, and I actually had wanted to be a psychiatrist. So, my proxy, as I mentioned, getting into this area has been fascinating, and I enjoyed that. So learning about this treatment and how it's used and how actually successful it is has been kind of interesting.
That is exactly the type of question I was asking. It doesn't have to be about law. It's just fascinating that you learned about magnets.
We got to keep learning. I mean, we can't stagnate, right?
100%. What I do like to do is I like to do a quick summary of the conversation we've had. So During this conversation, we landed up speaking, actually before we got on, we landed up speaking about the variety of work you do, including, and I'm going to do a quick sort of overall description, healthcare fraud, immigration violations, which I was totally surprised by. You're working on a deposition and a contract breach claim, all of which I would think would be each specialties all their own. So I'm fascinated that you do all of them. You talked about your experience starting with the savings and loan crisis. You talked about how you went from financial litigation, considered being a Fed, got into healthcare fraud, actually started off with what you'd consider more truer, if you will, healthcare fraud situations. And now you're seeing the development into medical necessity prosecution. We talked a little bit about the quote unquote badges of fraud. Example, no linen service, apparently, which I would not have thought was one of them. But there we go. We learned something new. We talked about data mining and aberrant prescribing, which are examples of the techniques we now use. You talked a little bit about that case around the linen service, which I thought was fascinating. Things like, as you pointed out, the no linen service, but also patients lining up and people saying that they were there for Molly, I think was an example you gave, which I think was fascinating. We talked about your experience both developing the online healthcare fraud case and actually developing healthcare fraud cases in general. So healthcare fraud course and developing healthcare fraud cases. You talked a little bit about your experience around the False Claims Act. You talked about some of the techniques associated with what the with what the DOJ and U.S. attorneys' offices do, which to me comes straight out of James Bond. And I'm looking forward to the next James Bond movie that has healthcare fraud in it, because apparently we have undercover people, we have wiretaps, we have asset freezes, and so much more. And we talked about malicious prosecution, where you talked about the credible evidence standard, which means absolutely nothing. Did I miss anything?
You haven't missed a thing. It's been a real pleasure. Real pleasure.
This was wonderful, Michael. Thank you so much. I hope we can have you on again soon. By the way, where can they reach you, Michael?
My email is mclark@bakerdonaldson.com, and I'm continuing to work remotely, so that's been kind of a nice thing. And anybody that wants to reach me, I'm more than happy to chat. This is again why we do these things, but more importantly, it's been fun catching up with you, and thank you for the invitation. It's been a real pleasure.
Of course, and thank you. For those of you who want to reach me, you can reach me on DarshanTalks on Twitter, or go to our website at DarshanTalks.com. If you like this podcast, please leave a comment, please subscribe. Please reach out to Michael if he can help you. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michael. This was wonderful.
Thank you.